Okay, let's jump right in. We have a core belief here that some books, well, they really must be challenged.
Exactly. And it's not because they're bad books. Far from it.
No, it's because they are so ambitious, so deeply researched, that they're basically inviting a rigorous intellectual engagement.
And for this critique, we're using a very specific framework. It's a step-by-step critical thinking process that maps the author's claims to the evidence.
We also bring in an intellectual framework, drawing from thinkers like Mortimer J. Adler, and we use an ethical lens like the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to find any asymmetries.
All of which leads to a balanced, logical conclusion. And today, our deep dive is focused entirely on C.W. Goodyear's sweeping biography, President Garfield, from radical to unifier.
Before we get into the meat of it, you should know that you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a much deeper and more dynamic book critique.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're taking this massive book, which really aims to rescue James A. Garfield from historical obscurity, and we're testing how well its central argument holds up under pressure.
So the shortcut for you, the listener, is that we're giving you the key takeaways and the big critical questions without you having to read all 700 dense pages.
At its heart, the book is about Garfield's life journey. It tracks him from his impoverished start in an Ohio log cabin.
A genuine frontier success story.
Absolutely. Then through his rise as a decorated Union general in the Civil War, his very long, very impactful career in the House during Reconstruction.
And finally, of course, his brief and tragically assassinated presidency in 1881.
Goodyear's project was, it was massive. He said he wanted to write the first full-dress biography of Garfield in 50 years.
And he wanted it to be both comprehensive and narratively compelling, not just dry history.
Right. He wanted to turn Gilded Age legislative battles into, well, high-stakes intrigue. It's really an intellectual biography focused on how Garfield's mind evolved.
And that very idea of evolution. That brings us to the book's core thesis, which is right there in the subtitle.
From radical to unifier. The argument is that Garfield started his career as a pure, unwavering radical Republican.
A champion for Black equality and civil rights.
But that he evolved over time into a more conciliatory figure, someone committed to uniting a very fractured Republican Party and, by extension, the entire post-Civil War nation.
So if we map out the claims, the author is really making three principal statements about Garfield. The first is that he was simply more intellectually gifted, a true polymath, than almost any other president of that era.
The man spoke Latin and Greek fluently, did complex calculations in his head during debates. It's impressive stuff.
The second claim is about his moral commitment, that he was genuinely progressive on slavery and Black civil rights during that early radical phase. He saw constitutional equality as completely non-negotiable.
And the third claim, which is the most complex, is that he was a rare political figure who tried to reconcile those high moral aims with the grinding reality of practical politics.
He was trying to navigate the swamp without sinking.
Exactly. And to support these claims, Goodyear builds this rich evidential backbone. We see Garfield's life story used over and over.
His rise from poverty, his time as an educator and an abolition-leaning preacher, his distinguished military service.
And, crucially, his role in shaping major Reconstruction-era legislation. In the author's view, he was always caught in the struggle between being a firebrand and a compromiser.
And the book argues that his short presidency wasn't just some historical footnote. His assassination, which came right after he took a stand against the spoil system.
The whole political patronage machine of the era.
Right, that his martyrdom actually helped galvanize the country toward cleaner civil service reform. It had a real consequential impact.
Okay, so now let's turn to our first critical checkpoint, the book's internal logic. If we apply the principle of coherence and ask, does the evidence really support the central frame? That subtitle, Radical to Unifier, becomes the main pressure point.
Does the book truly show a clean, smooth evolution from one identity to the other? Or did Garfield just adapt, toggling between roles as his ambition or his party required?
And this is where the analysis gets really nuanced. The evidence in the book itself often suggests less of a neat evolution and more of a durable, constant internal tension. Garfield remained rhetorically committed to Black rights, using that language of equality right up to his death. But as the 1870s wore on, he clearly got more invested in party harmony and national reconciliation.
The era kind of forced his hand, didn't it? After Reconstruction enforcement started to wane, being a radical became politically isolating.
So the question is, was he evolving his morals or was he changing his political strategy? That's the friction the book creates.
A distinction that critics have really seized upon. The radical to unifier arc is narratively satisfying, but it might be more of a metaphor than a precise claim.
Right. You could argue, based on Goodyear's own details, that Garfield was trying to have his cake and eat it too, keeping his radical ideals and his new conciliatory habits alive at the same time.
And labeling it a clean shift risks oversimplifying the profound moral complexity of that whole era, which Goodyear himself documents so well.
Compromise back then often meant abandoning the very people who needed protection the most. So his flexibility, while maybe admirable in one sense, could also have just been a political necessity.
Which naturally leads us to our second big critical checkpoint. The ethical dimensions of his career, looking through the lens of the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble.
Let's start with the Golden Rule. Treat others as you'd want to be treated. Early Garfield scores exceptionally well here.
Absolutely. He used his position to fight slavery, endorse expanded rights for formerly enslaved people, and insisted on military enforcement.
He clearly matched his own desire for dignity and opportunity with extending those goods to others. The book quotes him saying, "A republic based on the monstrous injustice of human slavery is just intolerable."
So his alignment with principle was strong, at least at the start.
The complexity comes in when we look at the U.S. preamble. It requires balancing competing goals, specifically establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility.
And Garfield spent his later career trying to balance those two forces. He supported civil rights, but he also spent immense political capital trying to calm down factional warfare in his own party.
But this is where we find the major ethical asymmetry, I point in the book sometimes, soft pedals. When Garfield started to soften enforcement or prioritize party unity, who paid the highest price?
The cost was borne disproportionately by the most vulnerable.
Black Southerners who relied on federal protection. That trade-off, sacrificing immediate justice for what he saw as long-term tranquility, is where his status as a unifier gets ethically very tricky.
And the narrative often focuses more on the Washington political drama than the real-world cost of those compromises in the South.
So to break this down, let's look at a dimensional analysis. First, on the dimension of intellect, the book's high praise is, well, it's well supported.
No question. He had the command of languages, mathematics, political economy. He was one of the ablest minds ever in the presidency.
But the critique notes that the book can sometimes drift from analysis into admiration, maybe not always holding him up against other key figures of the time.
Then there's his moral compass. We see that strong anti-slavery beginning, which sets a very high ethical bar.
But the later compromises, his pragmatic maneuvering in the 1870s, they raise legitimate questions about how consistent he was when pursuing justice interfered with politics.
His political style is where that unifier title really fits. He was highly skilled, a great mediator, able to hold a fractured party together.
A style that only becomes ethically problematic when the compromise itself sacrifices fundamental human rights. That's the tension the book never fully resolves.
But one thing that's really admirable about Goodyear's approach is the honesty around corruption.
Oh, absolutely. Garfield was no saint. He was both a beneficiary and a sharp critic of the spoils system. He operated within it while also fighting against it.
And that duality is critical. It shows him as an imperfect, complex figure, which is what you need for credible history.
Now let's pivot to the reading experience. Critics have universally praised this book. They call it spellbinding, tremendously enjoyable.
The most readable modern biography of Garfield. And Goodyear's prose really is energetic. He makes these dense legislative fights feel accessible.
But that narrative verve, that cinematic quality, is itself a double-edged sword. It can tempt an author to prioritize the big, dramatic set pieces.
Like the big speeches or the convention battles.
Exactly, and maybe overshadow the quieter but ethically crucial policy details being hammered out in committee rooms.
We also noticed some pacing issues. The middle section, on his many years in Congress, can feel a little overstuffed. It really slows down the momentum.
The book only snaps back into that gripping focus during the chaos of the 1880 convention and his brief presidency.
And that structural choice subtly reinforces a kind of great man at the top bias. By focusing so much on one man's maneuvers in Washington, it can underplay the agency of grassroots activists and ordinary citizens who are also shaping the debate.
And this brings us to a mindful moment, an interruption from Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
We'll just pause here and ask you, the listener.
Mhm.
Is the kind of unifier Garfield represents, this nuanced intellectual figure who sees all sides and suffers for it, is that the sort of leader today's polarized public actually wants?
Goodyear presents Garfield's nuance as a great strength, but our contemporary political systems often seem to reward the loudest purity and punish empathy and complexity. Something to think about.
So if we apply that final, profound question from Adler, what of it? The book's ultimate challenge to you is how you define unity.
Is it a unity grounded in justice? Or is it a unity grounded in simple exhaustion and a kind of historical amnesia?
A critical reading really requires you to ask in every chapter whether Garfield's push for reconciliation stayed tethered to the preamble's demand for justice and liberty for all.
Or whether his compromises sometimes just quieted conflict at the expense of those who couldn't protect themselves.
As a work of historical narration and, really, rehabilitation, President Garfield, from radical to unifier, is undeniably successful.
It absolutely rescues him from the category of interchangeable bearded presidents and gives us a rich portrait of a serious, capable statesman. It definitely passes the tests for breadth and depth.
The primary challenge, though, remains that framing.
Oh.
The tidy radical to unifier arc, well, it risks smoothing over the severe moral tension between justice and reconciliation.
And it does, at times, maybe amplify Garfield's historical significance a bit beyond a strictly comparative history.
Still, it's a compelling story and an invaluable ethical case study in Gilded Age politics. It's a deep look at how a brilliant, well-meaning person tries, and sometimes fails, to live out the golden rule inside the brutal machine of politics.
And we should acknowledge that this critique is grounded in systematic analysis that relies on primary documents, reputable biographies, and serious academic reviews. We're sharing the analytical output so that your own reading of the book remains your own informed encounter.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and think rationally about power, character, and justice.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.